The judge laughed at the old man, mocking his trembling hands and ignoring his evidence, but when a young woman stood up and played a secret recording, the entire courtroom froze. Faces changed. The judge went pale. What happened next shocked everyone. But let's start from the beginning. Howard Bailey stood quietly at the defendant's table, the courtroom light flickering above his head like a failing memory. At 78 years old, he looked out of place, like an old photo wedged into a modern frame. His tweed jacket, pressed but faded, carried the weight of decades, a relic from another time. He clutched a leather folder to his chest, knuckles white with tension, eyes scanning the room filled with strangers who didn't see him as a man, but as an inconvenience. Judge Sharon McKenna adjusted her robe and leaned forward with the sort of slow theatricality that suggested she thought she was the smartest person in the room. Her bench towered above the rest like a throne, her gavel positioned just right for dramatic effect. "Well, Mr. Bailey," she began, her voice smooth with sarcasm, "I hope you didn't miss bingo night for this." A ripple of laughter passed through the courtroom gallery, not loud, not cruel, but sharp enough to sting. The prosecutor, a young, impatient woman named Karen Dillon, smirked as she crossed her arms and looked at the old man like he was a waste of oxygen. Howard didn't respond. His lips were pressed into a thin line, jaw clenched, not from anger, from shame, from holding back. "Let's be honest," McKenna continued, her tone almost playful. "You're here contesting a foreclosure that's already been processed, paperwork filed, notices served. I'm not sure what you expect to accomplish." "I paid those months," Howard said softly, his voice gravelly but steady. "I have receipts." He raised the folder, the gesture trembling like a leaf on wind. No one moved to take it. McKenna raised an eyebrow. "Receipts? From where? A cereal box?" More laughter. Even the bailiff chuckled. Not loud, but enough for Howard to hear it. That was the worst part. They weren't trying to be cruel. That would have made it easier to fight. They just didn't care. Howard's hand slowly lowered. His back felt heavy. Not from age, from the unbearable weight of being dismissed. Again, he'd come prepared. The night before, he'd stayed up until 2 a.m., reviewing every document with a magnifying glass because his eyesight was failing. He double-checked his checkbook, printed out statements from the library computer, highlighted dates, annotated margins. He'd even ironed his shirt twice because he wanted to look respectable. And now, he was a joke. "Mr. Bailey," the judge sighed, "we have limited time today, and frankly, I don't see anything new or compelling here. You've had your chance to respond during the foreclosure process, and—" "I did respond," Howard interrupted, louder this time, not yelling, but not soft either. "I sent letters. No one answered. I called 3 times. They said they'd look into it. Then they stopped picking up." McKenna narrowed her eyes. "Are you suggesting the bank mishandled your case?" Howard hesitated. The truth was tangled in his throat. He didn't want to sound paranoid. He didn't want to seem unhinged. But what else could he say? "I think," he said slowly, "someone didn't want me to be heard." A heavy pause. The courtroom shifted. Judge McKenna gave a tight, sarcastic smile. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Bailey. And coming from someone with no legal training, no representation, and, frankly, nothing substantial to show for himself." She leaned closer to the mic. "This court doesn't entertain conspiracy theories." That did it. The room laughed again. Not everyone, but enough. A few people shook their heads. Others stared into their phones. Even the stenographer, tasked with recording every word, looked visibly bored, chewing gum with slow indifference. Howard sat down, folding in on himself like an empty coat. He thought of Evelyn, his wife. She died in that house. In their bed. Cancer. The same month the first foreclosure letter arrived. It had been the worst month of his life, and somewhere in that darkness he missed something. A deadline, a document, maybe even a payment. But he corrected it all by the next month, or so he thought. Now it was like she died for nothing. McKenna turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have any additional statements, Ms. Dillon?" Karen Dillon didn't even glance at Howard. "Your Honor, this is a textbook case of delay tactics. The defendant had multiple opportunities to appeal. He chose not to." "I didn't choose," Howard began, but McKenna slammed the gavel, cutting him off. "You're not to speak unless addressed, Mr. Bailey." The sound of the gavel echoed like a gunshot in his chest. Howard stared at the table. His fingers touched the corner of his folder. He didn't cry. He wouldn't give them that. But inside, something cracked. There was no jury, just cold law, cold people. In the back of the room, the door opened with a soft click. A young woman with a leather messenger bag entered, quietly slipping into the last bench. She tilted her head, watching, listening. Her name was Natalie Pierce, and though no one in that courtroom knew it yet, including Howard himself, she was about to change everything. But in that moment, Howard didn't see her. He saw nothing but years of service, at the post office, at his church, in his community, evaporating like steam over polished marble floors. He thought of Evelyn's last words, "Promise me you'll stay in the house." And he had. He fought. He stayed. But now, as the judge raised her gavel again, preparing to dismiss the case for good, Howard felt the weight of something deeper than injustice. He felt erased. And that's when Natalie stood up. When Howard was a boy, his father taught him two things. Never raise your voice in a room where people don't want to listen. And never walk away from something worth fighting for. He had followed both rules all his life. Until now in this courtroom, where neither seemed to matter anymore. The folder in his hands was heavy not just with papers, but with memories. Years of saving, of budgeting on a modest postal worker's salary, of handwritten ledgers that Evelyn used to keep in a shoebox labeled "just in case." Their home wasn't large, a one-story craftsman-style house with chipped blue paint, creaky wooden floors, and a back porch where they used to drink tea every Sunday morning. But it was theirs, paid in full, until Evelyn got sick. The cancer came quickly, one hospital bill, then another. Medications they hadn't expected, emergency surgeries that didn't help. Howard had dipped into every fund they had. He sold his old pickup. He canceled cable. He even pawned his late brother's Medal of Honor, all so Evelyn could have another chance. And she fought. God, she fought, until she couldn't anymore. The same week he scattered her ashes beneath the oak tree in their backyard. The first envelope came. A notice. Cold, clinical. Delinquency in payment. Possible foreclosure. Respond within 30 days. He had responded. He wrote a letter, by hand. He mailed it certified. He followed up by phone. He even walked to the bank once. But they told him everything had to go through the servicing company. Then came the silence. No letters, no callbacks, just silence. And now, as he sat in that courtroom, with his shoulders hunched and his heart dragging behind him like an old suitcase, all he could think was, how did we get here? Judge McKenna clicked her pen repeatedly as she stared at the screen in front of her, eyes glazed with disinterest. Howard tried again. His voice cracked a little this time, but he pushed through it. "I can show proof of 3 payments, Your Honor. They cleared from my account. I have bank statements here, dates, amounts, check numbers. I even highlighted them." No response. Not from the judge, not from the prosecutor, not from anyone. He looked around, almost pleading. "Please, Just let me show them." From the gallery, someone scoffed. "What's he gonna show? A grocery list?" Another laugh. Howard didn't turn. He just clutched the folder tighter. He remembered the night he stayed up to prepare these documents. He'd made tea and sat under the yellow kitchen light, surrounded by receipts. The heater didn't work well anymore, so he wore his thick socks. The ones Evelyn always said made him look like a cartoon grandpa. He missed her laugh. He missed everything. There was a cough from the back of the courtroom. The young woman, Natalie, leaned forward in her seat. Her eyes narrowed, locking on to something the others missed entirely. The quiet despair on the old man's face. Not anger, not delusion, just pain. Judge McKenna finally looked up. "Mr. Bailey," she said, voice syrupy with finality. "I'm not trying to be unkind, but we have rules in this court. Evidence must be submitted through proper legal channels. You've had multiple notices and ignored them." "I didn't ignore anything," he replied, barely above a whisper. "They ignored me." The room fell quiet for a moment. Then the judge leaned forward. "Are you suggesting that the court system conspired against you?" Howard hesitated. He looked down at his hands. His fingers trembled, not from age, but from something deeper. "I'm saying," he said slowly, "that somewhere along the line, someone stopped caring." The judge sighed. "Mr. Bailey, without legal counsel, you're making it difficult for the court to proceed. I'll be ruling shortly unless the prosecution has anything further to add." Karen Dillon, the prosecutor, flipped through her file and closed it with a loud snap. "No further comments, Your Honor. We rest our position." Howard lowered his head. That was it. He knew it. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about being heard, about not fading into the background like wallpaper once your usefulness was gone, about the promise he made to Evelyn the night before she died. She had taken his hand and whispered, "Don't let them take the house, Howie. Promise me, no matter what happens." He promised, and now he was about to break it. The folder slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud. Papers scattered like leaves, yellowed and curled at the edges, evidence of a man who tried everything he could with what little he had. Still, no one moved, except for Natalie. She stood slowly, unsure at first if she was even allowed to speak. She wasn't dressed like a lawyer. No blazer, no clipboard, just jeans and a wrinkled blazer over a faded t-shirt. But her eyes were sharp, alert, and angry. "Your Honor," she said, voice louder than expected, "I believe this man is telling the truth." McKenna's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly are you?" "My name is Natalie Pierce. I'm a law clerk, not licensed, but I have every right to speak as a citizen." The judge rolled her eyes. "Unless you're representing him, which you're not, I suggest you sit down." But Natalie didn't. Instead, she stepped forward and looked at Howard. He looked back at her like he was seeing a lighthouse in a fog. "I overheard this case was happening," she said calmly, "and I recognized Mr. Bailey's name. My father used to work with him at the post office. He said Howard was the only man he ever knew who refused to cut corners. Said he once walked 3 extra miles during a snowstorm just to deliver a pension check to a widow who'd missed it." She bent down and began picking up his papers. "I don't think he's lying, and I think this court is making a mistake." McKenna pounded her gavel once. "Miss Pierce, that's enough." "No," Natalie interrupted. "What's enough is dismissing people because they're old, because they don't know how to work the system, because they don't have fancy lawyers or digital PDFs." Howard stared at her, blinking. And for the first time that day, the courtroom fell completely silent. Something had shifted, and though no one yet knew how this would end, the game had just changed. Natalie's voice didn't echo in the grand courtroom. It cut, clear, steady, and unexpected. Everyone turned to look at her, as if only now realizing she wasn't just another bored observer. Howard blinked at her, unsure if she was real. She looked so out of place. Messy hair tied up in a pencil bun, a second-hand blazer 2 sizes too big, scuffed boots. She could have been anyone. And yet, in that moment, she was the only person who made him feel seen. "I'd like to review his documents," she said, addressing the court again. "I may not be licensed yet, but I know enough to recognize due process violations. And this case smells like one." Judge McKenna arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Ms. Pierce, are you seriously trying to insert yourself into this proceeding?" "I'm trying to stop a miscarriage of justice," Natalie said, stepping toward Howard's table. It wouldn't be the first time a system ignored a voice just because it didn't sound expensive enough. The judge didn't even try to hide her irritation now. "You're not counsel. You're not even on the docket. Sit down or leave, Ms. Pierce." Howard watched this young woman stand firm, trembling slightly but refusing to back down. Her eyes weren't angry. They were determined. "I'm not leaving," she said, "because I think Mr. Bailey's being railroaded. And if you won't let me speak as his advocate, then I'll speak as a witness to what you said to me earlier this morning." Now the judge froze. So did the gallery. "I beg your pardon?" McKenna said slowly. Natalie didn't flinch. "You said, and I quote, 'I've got 3 foreclosure cases to clear today, including some old-timers still whining about a bank error. We need to wrap it up quick.'" The courtroom rippled with unease. The bailiff shifted his weight. The prosecutor looked up sharply. "And how exactly," McKenna said, voice tense, "do you plan to prove you heard such a thing?" Natalie took a breath, then pulled her phone from her bag. "I recorded it." The silence that followed was total. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room, it presses down on it, like air thickening around truth. Howard's mouth parted slightly, stunned. "Ms. Pierce," the judge said through clenched teeth, "you illegally recorded a private conversation." "No," Natalie interrupted. "This is a one-party consent state. I'm allowed to record any conversation I'm a part of. You knew that." The judge was clearly flustered. Her fingers tapped nervously on the bench. Even if that were admissible, it's irrelevant to the facts of the case. Natalie stepped beside Howard now, holding her phone like it was a sword. "It's not irrelevant if it proves you pre-decided this case before it even began. That's bias, Your Honor. That's judicial misconduct." Howard could barely process what was happening. 10 minutes ago, he was invisible. Now someone, a stranger, was standing between him and the full weight of a system that had crushed him. He opened his mouth. "Why are you doing this?" Natalie turned to him, her voice softening. "Because when I was 8 years old, you helped my dad. You stayed late so he could make it to my school recital on time. He never forgot it. And when I saw your name on the docket this morning..." She smiled. "I couldn't forget it either." Howard's chest tightened, not from illness or age, but from something long dormant. Hope. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, slowly, gratefully. The courtroom was still quiet, but now the silence felt different, heavy, like the entire room was holding its breath. Karen Dillon, the prosecutor, finally rose. "Your Honor," she said cautiously, "I recommend we recess briefly to review the recording. Given the accusation, we may need to reassess the validity of this hearing." McKenna's face was stone. "Denied." Natalie didn't blink. "Then I'll be emailing this recording to the State Judicial Review Board. Right now." She raised her phone. Her thumb hovered. The judge stood up. "This court is in recess," she barked, slamming the gavel. Too late. Everyone had seen what they needed to see. Howard sat, stunned, as the judge stormed into her chambers. Natalie gently gathered the spilled documents from the floor, her hands steady now. She didn't look like a girl trying to impress anyone. She looked like someone who had just walked through fire for a stranger. Howard whispered, "They won't let you get away with this, you know." She glanced at him. "Let me? Mr. Bailey? We're just getting started." A beat. He looked down at the folder in his lap, now torn and creased from the chaos. "I thought I was going to lose everything." Natalie sat beside him. "You were, until someone finally decided to listen." And for the first time in a long time, Howard Bailey didn't feel small. He felt seen. The courtroom doors creaked open again 20 minutes later. Judge McKenna returned to the bench, her expression carefully arranged, the same way a guilty child might try to appear innocent. Her eyes scanned the room like searchlights, pausing briefly on Natalie and Howard, who sat quietly at the defense table. Everyone could feel it. Something had changed. She tapped the gavel once, far softer than before. "This court is back in session." Natalie had spent the recess replaying the conversation on her phone for anyone who would listen. The bailiff heard it. A journalist from the local paper, who just happened to be sitting in the back, typed furiously as it played. Even one of the paralegals from another case wandered over and left visibly shaken. The audio was damning. McKenna's voice, unmistakable, had joked about clearing out dead wood from her docket. She mentioned an old-timer and an easy win. No mention of facts, no consideration of due process, just a desire to move things along. And now she was back, pretending it never happened. "I've reviewed the documents Mr. Bailey submitted," she announced. "While they are informal and do not follow strict procedural guidelines, the court does acknowledge that they contain what appears to be financial information." Natalie raised an eyebrow. "Appears to be?" Howard sat perfectly still, but Natalie could feel the tension in his body, like a kettle about to whistle. McKenna continued, "Therefore, in the interest of fairness," but Natalie stood before she could finish. "Your Honor, we move for immediate dismissal of the foreclosure on the grounds that the court's impartiality has been compromised." McKenna narrowed her eyes. "You are not recognized as legal counsel. I will not entertain motions from a law clerk." Natalie didn't blink. "Then I'll say it plainly. You've been caught. And now you're scrambling." Gasps. The gallery was fully alert now, no phones out, at least not visibly, but attention was locked. Karen Dillon, the prosecutor, cleared her throat. "Your Honor, in light of the new evidence, the state is willing to request a continuance while we—" McKenna slammed her gavel. "No continuance. This is my courtroom and—" "Exactly," Natalie cut in. "Your courtroom, your rules, your shortcuts." She placed a sheet of paper on the table in front of her. It was a printed transcript of the audio. She had typed it out by hand during the recess. Underlined portions in red ink burned like wounds on the page. "I think the press, the review board, and the Bar Association will all find this interesting." McKenna's lip twitched. "You're threatening a sitting judge?" "I'm offering you a door," Natalie said calmly. "You can walk out of it now with dignity, or be dragged out by headlines tomorrow." The air was electric. Then came a long silence, heavy, humid. You could hear the hum of the lights, the rustle of someone shifting their coat. Howard reached into his folder and pulled out 3 check copies. Old, yes, but legible. He handed them to Natalie with trembling fingers. She held them up. "These checks," she said, "match the exact months he was accused of missing. They were cashed by the bank. You can see the stamps, the routing numbers, all verifiable." She turned to Karen Dillon. "Why weren't these found in the original investigation?" The prosecutor hesitated. "We only received a summary from the bank, not the full statement history." Natalie didn't need to say anything else. The implication was clear. Someone had filtered the truth. McKenna's eyes flickered with something that looked like panic, just for a second. Then she tried to recover. These documents should have been submitted through formal counsel, chain of custody. They weren't because Mr. Bailey couldn't afford formal counsel, Natalie snapped. And that's why you thought you could steamroll him, because he didn't have the tools to fight back. Howard slowly lifted his head, finally speaking. I just wanted someone to listen. And now the entire courtroom was listening. Natalie held up the audio transcript again. This isn't just judicial misconduct. It's discrimination, against age, against class, against decency. A murmur spread through the room. Reporters began scribbling again. A bailiff whispered to a colleague. Somewhere in the back, the court administrator quietly exited through a side door, probably to make a phone call. And then, quietly, softly, McKenna said, This hearing is suspended pending further review. She stood, not like a judge, like a person trying to disappear. As she exited, her heels clicked loudly across the polished floor, but her power had already left the room. Natalie turned to Howard. We're not done, she said, but we've cracked it open. You're not losing your home today. Howard didn't cry. He just exhaled, a sound that was half relief, half disbelief. You didn't even know me, he said. No, Natalie replied, but I knew what was right. The courtroom emptied slowly, people whispering and glancing back at them as they passed. Some nodded, some looked ashamed. Karen Dillon left with her head low. Howard gathered his papers, but they didn't feel heavy anymore. Outside, the sun had come out, weak and pale, but warm. And for the first time in months, Howard stepped into the light without feeling like it might burn him. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed like a kicked beehive. Whispers clung to every hallway, every office. Staff avoided eye contact. Reporters hovered near the security line like vultures waiting for something to die. Judge McKenna was expected to return to the bench that day. Officially, the hearing was only suspended. But unofficially, everyone knew the damage had already been done. In a quiet office 2 floors up, McKenna sat in front of her computer, rereading the email she'd received at 6:03 a.m. Subject, Judicial Complaint. Acknowledged. Case number 47, C.J. Probity. It was from the State Commission on Judicial Conduct, and it wasn't a courtesy message. It was the beginning of an inquiry. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee. Gone cold hours ago. She didn't drink it. She just needed something to hold on to. Across town, Natalie Pierce stood at the base of the courthouse steps with Howard Bailey, both of them looking up at the stone building like it was something alive, something breathing. Howard clutched a manila folder under his arm. Not the same old leather one. That one was too damaged. Natalie had given him a new one. Think she's really going to show? He asked. Natalie nodded. She has to. If she doesn't, it's an admission of guilt. Howard didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, I'm not sure I want to see her again. You won't need to, Natalie said. After today, she won't be your problem anymore. They walked through the lobby together. People stared. The court clerk gave Howard a small nod, almost imperceptible. But it was the first time anyone inside the system had acknowledged him as more than just a case number. When they entered the courtroom, they were met with a surprise. The gallery was packed. Reporters, law students, court watchers, a few elderly folks Howard didn't know but who looked at him with something between respect and hope. At 10:02 a.m., the side door opened. Judge McKenna entered, but she wasn't wearing her robe. She was in a gray pantsuit, formal but not judicial. No gavel, no elevated bench. Instead, another judge, an older black woman with steel gray hair and piercing eyes, walked in behind her, donning the robe and sitting in her place. McKenna took a seat at the side table. Alone. Whispers surged like waves. Natalie leaned into Howard. "That's Judge Evelyn Harris. Federal oversight. She's here for emergency review hearings." Howard stared. "They brought in a judge? For the judge?" Natalie smiled. "Welcome to the turning point." Judge Harris adjusted her glasses. "This hearing is now a preliminary review of misconduct allegations against Judge Sharon McKenna in light of new audio evidence and procedural concerns raised during the foreclosure case of Mr. Howard Bailey." McKenna shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Howard sat straighter, clutching the arms of his chair. He wasn't smiling, but the weight in his chest felt different now, like the first inhale after coming up for air. "Mr. Bailey," Judge Harris continued, "we have reviewed your submitted financial records. We have also heard testimony from law clerk Natalie Pierce, as well as an independent audit of the foreclosure handling. Based on preliminary findings—" She paused. Everyone leaned in. "This court finds sufficient grounds to immediately void the foreclosure judgment. The property in question shall remain in Mr. Bailey's legal possession, effective immediately." Applause erupted in the back, until the bailiff barked for order. Howard lowered his head. His hands trembled again, but not from fear this time, from release. But Judge Harris wasn't done. "We are also forwarding a recommendation to the State Commission for a formal hearing on the actions of Judge McKenna, specifically her prejudicial comments, failure to properly consider evidence, and indication of docket-clearing bias." McKenna finally stood. "I've served this court for 17 years, she said stiffly. "I've ruled on thousands of cases. Are we really going to destroy a career over the word of a what?" Judge Harris asked calmly. McKenna hesitated. "Of a law clerk with no standing. Ms. Pierce's recording, verified for authenticity, shows a clear lapse in your duty of impartiality. The robe," she said coldly, "doesn't make you above accountability." McKenna sat back down. She didn't argue again. Natalie stood now, her voice steady. "With respect, Your Honor, I would like to submit a petition for the court to consider a full audit of other foreclosure cases handled by Judge McKenna over the past 12 months. Harris nodded. "Approved." Gasps. Howard looked at Natalie, eyes wide. "You really think this goes deeper?" She turned to him, voice low. "I know it does." As the hearing adjourned, people approached Howard one by one. Some shook his hand. Some just smiled. But all of them, even those who hadn't known his name yesterday, now looked at him like something more than a forgotten senior in a broken system. He turned to Natalie outside the courthouse. The sun was warm again. "You didn't have to do all this," he said. "I know." "You could have walked away." She shrugged. "So could you. But you didn't." He thought about Evelyn, about that promise. "You saved my home." "No," Natalie replied. "You saved it. I just made sure the truth had a microphone." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Natalie reached into her bag and pulled out the original leather folder, worn, creased, but repaired. She handed it to him. "I thought you might want it back." Howard took it like it was made of glass. He didn't speak. But in his silence, for the first time in a long, long time, there was peace. By the time Howard stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon, the world outside had already changed. Not just for him, but for dozens of others whose lives had quietly been swept into folders, mislabeled, ignored, or judged before they even spoke. The news had spread faster than anyone expected. Local judge under investigation after leaked recording reveals courtroom bias. Foreclosure on retired veteran overturned after shocking courtroom twist. Law clerk exposes judicial misconduct, sparks statewide review. These were the headlines that flashed across phones and TV screens in every diner and barbershop in town. Howard didn't have a smartphone, so he only knew about it when his neighbor, Paul, showed up on his porch the next morning with a wrinkled newspaper and a look of disbelief. "Howard," Paul said, unfolding the front page. "You're on the damn front page, man." Howard squinted at the grainy photo. Him, blurry and hunched over, just outside the courtroom steps, flanked by Natalie. Above the image, bold black letters read, "A voice finally heard." Paul sat beside him on the porch swing, the morning sun cutting through the wooden slats. "I always knew you were stubborn, but I didn't know you had that in you." "I didn't," Howard said. "She did." Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Natalie was offered a job by 3 law firms. She declined them all. Instead, she filed paperwork to create her own nonprofit legal center, aimed at providing free legal advocacy for the elderly, particularly those battling foreclosure, eviction, or predatory banking practices. Howard became her first official client, and her first board member. They called it the Evelyn Foundation, named after the woman whose memory had fueled a promise and nearly lost a home. Meanwhile, the Judicial Conduct Commission launched a full-scale inquiry into Judge McKenna's case history. They pulled 47 foreclosure cases she'd overseen in the last year alone. What they found was troubling. A pattern of speedy dismissals, denied appeals, ignored affidavits, and repeated reliance on limited or third-party summaries from banking institutions. In several cases, homeowners had complained, but their voices were buried under bureaucracy. Until now. One woman, a widowed teacher named Lorraine Jacobs, had lost her home in just 17 days after her husband died. She came forward after seeing Howard's story on the news. So did others. Veterans, single parents, elderly couples. Natalie worked late into the night compiling their statements, organizing timelines, and flagging red flags. The courthouse, once a symbol of cold routine, had become a battleground for overdue justice. Howard returned to his home with a reinstated deed and a court-stamped letter declaring the foreclosure null and void. He hung the letter next to his wedding photo. "I kept the promise, Evie," he whispered one morning, touching the glass. "We're still here." People began stopping him on the street, at the pharmacy, at church. Some just shook his hand. Others shared their own stories, ones they'd never told anyone. One afternoon, a teenager approached him in the grocery store parking lot. "Mr. Bailey?" he asked nervously. "I'm doing a report for school on people who stand up for what's right. Can I interview you?" Howard chuckled. "I'm just an old man who didn't know when to shut up." The boy smiled. "Exactly." But for all the attention, Howard never forgot that it all began because one person, just one, decided to listen. Natalie, for her part, didn't let the momentum stop. She contacted local universities and invited law students to intern at the Evelyn Foundation. She started a podcast called Voices on Record, where she read real letters from real people struggling to be heard by the system. The first episode? Howard's story, told in his own voice, recorded from his porch. It went viral. Even the state's attorney general issued a statement applauding Natalie's courage and calling for increased scrutiny on judicial impartiality in civil proceedings. As for Judge McKenna, she submitted her resignation 3 weeks later. No press conference, no apology, just a short letter citing personal reasons. But everyone knew the truth. Natalie didn't celebrate. She just said, "That's one down. There will be others." The day the official audit report was released, Howard received a letter in the mail. It was from one of the homeowners who had come forward. A man named Gerald, 82, who'd nearly lost his home after missing a single payment due to a medical emergency. "I saw your story," the letter read, "and it made me try one last time. They reopened my case. I just wanted to say thank you. Because of you, I didn't give up." Howard stared at the letter for a long time. It had been years since anyone had told him he mattered. He folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and tucked it into the pocket of his old coat, the same one he wore to court, just in case he ever needed a reminder. And on the wall of the new Evelyn Foundation office, framed in gold leaf, hung a simple plaque with the words, "Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be heard. H. Bailey." The courthouse hallway, once the center of her domain, now echoed too loudly under her footsteps. Judge Sharon McKenna walked through it like a ghost. People moved aside, not out of deference, but out of discomfort. Her name, once spoken with respect or caution, now floated through conversations like a warning. She had turned in her resignation. No hearing, no admission of guilt, just a carefully worded letter citing health reasons and professional fatigue. But no one was fooled. The plaque bearing her name had already been removed from courtroom 2B. The varnished wood looked almost sad, as if it missed her, or perhaps was relieved she was gone. She passed an intern in the hallway. The girl looked up, recognized her, and immediately looked away. That stung more than she'd expected. Back in her office, McKenna sat behind her desk for what might have been the last time. She stared at the file she refused to shred. Howard Bailey's case folder. The man she had mocked, dismissed, and tried to erase in less than 10 minutes. She opened the folder again. The handwriting was shaky but clear. His notes in the margins, his highlighted payments, his little yellow sticky notes that said things like, "Call again," and "Ask for bank confirmation." He had tried, and she hadn't even looked. She told herself she was just clearing backlog. She told herself he was just another holdout, that she didn't have time to re-examine every single complaint that came her way, that if the bank said he missed a payment, he probably did. But now, stripped of her title, none of those excuses sounded like justice. The door opened behind her. Her former clerk, Miles, stood silently with a box. "They asked me to help clear your desk." She didn't speak. "I'll, start with the books?" "Leave the books," she muttered. "Take the robe." Miles paused, then gently folded the black robe and laid it in the box. He didn't meet her eyes. When he left, she sat there in the quiet, staring at the desk like it was a crime scene. She picked up her phone and opened the voicemail app. Natalie had never left a message. Howard hadn't either. But the silence was louder than any rebuke. Across town, Howard sat in his favorite wooden chair on the porch, a soft breeze lifting the edges of a newspaper in his lap. A thermos of tea steamed gently beside him. He'd heard McKenna had resigned. Natalie told him over coffee, her tone carefully neutral, as if not sure whether he'd feel satisfaction or sorrow. But he felt neither. What he felt was clarity. He didn't need an apology. She wouldn't mean it anyway. What he needed, he already had. His home, his name cleared, and the knowledge that truth had finally outlived power. That was enough. Natalie joined him that afternoon with a stack of folders and a lopsided sandwich she'd made at 1 a.m. "You sure you want to stay on the board?" she teased. "You know I'm going to make you read legal drafts." "I read worse things in the war," Howard deadpanned. She laughed. "That's fair." He nodded toward the street. "You think she'll try to come back? McKenna?" "No," Natalie said. "She might still practice law someday, maybe, but not from a bench. That part of her life is gone." Howard didn't respond right away. Then, "I wonder if she even knows why this happened." Natalie looked at him. "Does it matter?" He sipped his tea. "Not for me, but maybe for someone like her. It's a long fall when you think you're the tallest thing in the room." Natalie placed a folder on the porch table. It was labeled, "Outreach, Former Cases, McKenna Review." "There's more people like you," she said. "And I think you might be able to help them." Howard stared at the folder. Slowly, he reached out and opened it. Not to read it yet, just to feel it. Behind him, wind chimes rattled gently, the kind Evelyn had loved. The sound filled the silence like a whisper from the past. A week later, a letter arrived at McKenna's home. There was no return address, but the handwriting was careful and neat, and unmistakably old-fashioned. "You were wrong. You won't say it, but I will. Not for me. I've made peace. But I hope you remember next time you feel powerful. Power means listening, not deciding before the story begins." H.B. McKenna folded the letter slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just sat there, holding it, as the sun crept across her living room floor and the shadows stretched toward her feet. Outside, the world moved on without her, and on the wall of the Evelyn Foundation, a new quote was added beside the plaque. "Some apologies never come, but justice doesn't wait for them." It had been exactly 1 year since that courtroom erupted in silence, a silence more powerful than any argument, any verdict, any gavel ever struck. Howard Bailey stood alone outside the newly opened Evelyn Foundation Community Legal Center. His suit was freshly pressed, his tie slightly askew, a small detail he refused to let Natalie fix. "Keeps me human," he'd joke. In his hand, he held a worn envelope. Inside was a copy of the deed to his house. The corrected deed, recertified, restamped, and signed with a single bold phrase: "In full and permanent ownership, Howard Bailey." He'd framed it at home. But this copy? This one was for something else. The building's dedication ceremony was small, by design. No cameras, no microphones, just a dozen chairs, a few former clients, some staff, and Natalie standing at the front in a navy blazer and worn-out Converse sneakers. "Good evening," she said. "We're not here to cut ribbons or pose for news. We're here because something that shouldn't have happened did, and because someone who wasn't supposed to win did." She turned to Howard, eyes glinting. "I can list his case number. I can talk about the violations, the audit, the fallout. But I won't. Because Howard Bailey didn't fight to make headlines. He fought to keep a promise. And in the process, he made space for all of us to be heard." There was a pause, then applause. Not loud, but long. From hearts, not hands. Howard stepped forward slowly. He didn't like speeches, never had. But something in the air tonight felt different. He took the mic, coughed once, and looked out at the small crowd. His voice was soft, but it carried. "I never wanted to be known for a court case," he said. "I wanted to grow tomatoes and fix radios and sit on my porch with my wife. But life's funny. It gives you quiet years and then suddenly asks you to raise your voice." He looked at Natalie. "I didn't know how. She did." He pulled the envelope from his coat and handed it to her. "I already have one of these," he said, "but I think this one belongs here. Because this building, it's more than legal help. It's a second chance for voices like mine. For anyone who was ever told they don't matter." Natalie's hands trembled slightly as she took the envelope. "Thank you," she whispered. The plaque had already been mounted inside. Visitors would see it just before the reception desk. The Evelyn Foundation named in honor of the promise that started it all. No voice is too quiet when truth stands behind it. H. Bailey. In the weeks that followed, the center took on 12 new clients. Some cases were simple, others were complicated. All were urgent in their own way. One woman brought in a stack of papers from a payday loan company threatening to garnish her disability checks. Another came in tears after her landlord changed the locks illegally. Natalie handled each one with the same intensity she gave Howard's case. Howard didn't do legal work. He said his brain wasn't built for statutes and loopholes, but he came in every morning anyway, at 7:30 sharp, with coffee and muffins for the team. "Found this recipe in Evelyn's old notebook," he'd say, eyes twinkling. When the interns asked him for advice, he always said the same thing. Don't fight to win, fight to be heard. The winning comes later. And it did. One of the first interns later passed the bar and became a full-time staff attorney. Another started a similar initiative in a neighboring county. Natalie traveled twice to speak at law schools, not as a guest, but as a case study in systemic reform. Howard never joined her on those trips. He stayed home. The house was still standing, freshly painted, finally re-insulated, and full of life. Neighbors dropped off meals. Strangers left letters in the mailbox. Even the local middle school sent a group of 8th graders once to interview him for a local hero project. He didn't think of himself that way. He just thought of Evelyn. And one quiet afternoon, he sat on the porch alone, tea steaming in his hands, as the wind carried the sound of laughter from the sidewalk. A group of children passing by, carefree, unburdened. And in that moment, he realized something. He had spent months fighting noise, bureaucracy, indifference, cruelty. But in the end, what saved him was silence. The silence of that courtroom when Natalie spoke. The silence of a judge, finally out of arguments. The silence of the world, finally listening. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it was powerful. And sometimes, he thought, that's what real justice sounds like. Not a gavel, not a roar, just a still room holding its breath, waiting for the truth to speak.